On February 20th, 1974, a young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki stood inside the jungle of Lubang Island in the Philippines, waiting for a man most people had already turned into a rumor. For years, islanders had spoken about armed shadows in the hills. Rice vanished, cattle were killed. Search parties came back with fear in their faces. Families in Japan had sent letters. Government teams had dropped leaflets. Loudspeakers had called into the trees. But somewhere in that green wall, one soldier still believed the Second World War was alive. Then Suzuki saw him. A thin, hardened man stepped out of the jungle with a rifle, a sword, and the eyes of someone who had spent nearly 3 decades trusting no one. His uniform was old. His body had aged, but his war had not. His name was Hiroo Onoda. Suzuki told him Japan had surrendered long ago. The cities had rebuilt. The Emperor's War was over. The world had moved on. Onoda did not come down. He said he would surrender only if his commanding officer ordered him to. That was the impossible part. The world had spent 29 years trying to prove the war was over. But for Hiroo Onoda, proof was not enough. He needed permission. Please subscribe to Drafted History for more forgotten history and declassified stories. Watch till the end, because the truth is not that simple. And comment on your country below. Hiroo Onoda was not sent to Lubang Island as a regular soldier waiting for orders in a trench. He was a second lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Army, trained for intelligence work and guerrilla warfare. He had studied at the Futamata branch of the Nakano School, where men learned how to survive behind enemy lines, how to sabotage, how to hide, and how to keep fighting when normal units had already been broken. On December 26, 1944, Onoda arrived on Lubang, an island southwest of Manila. His assignment was clear. He was to help damage the island's airstrip and harbor facilities, interfere with Allied operations, and prepare for a long fight after the main battle passed over him. According to later accounts, his orders carried one message deeper than all the rest: do not surrender and do not take your own life. Keep fighting until the Japanese army returns. That order sounds simple on paper. In a jungle, after the radio goes silent and the empire collapses behind you, it becomes something much darker. Lubang was not some empty battlefield. People lived there. Farmers worked there. Families had homes there. And when Onoda looked down from the hills, he was not seeing ordinary civilians trying to survive the occupation and the return of war. He was seeing possible enemies, possible spies, possible traps. On February 28, 1945, American and Philippine forces landed on Lubang. Most of the Japanese defense fell apart quickly. Some soldiers died. Others surrendered. But Onoda did not. 3 men stayed with him: Yuichi Akatsu, Shoichi Shimada, and Kinshichi Kazuka. Together, they disappeared into the mountains. At first, their decisions still belonged to the war. Japan had not yet formally surrendered. The fighting across the Pacific was still violent and uncertain. Men in the jungle could tell themselves they were waiting for orders, waiting for reinforcements, waiting for the next phase of the campaign. But the next phase never came. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. On September 2, 1945, the formal surrender documents were signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. For most of the world, the war was now history. But history did not reach Onoda in a way he was willing to believe. That is the first thing that makes this story so disturbing. The problem was not that nobody tried to tell him. They did. Leaflets appeared saying the war was over. Later, more notices were dropped, including surrender orders connected to General Tomoyuki Yamashita's 14th Area Army. To men who had been trained to expect enemy deception, every paper from the sky looked suspicious. Every message sounded like a trick. Every invitation to surrender seemed too easy. Onoda and his men studied the leaflets. Then they rejected them. They told themselves a defeated enemy would lie. They told themselves Japan could not have surrendered. They told themselves the empire would return. And once they made that choice, every new sign of peace became more evidence of war. That is how a battlefield becomes a prison. The men survived on what the island gave them and what they took: bananas, coconuts, stolen rice, livestock. They moved through thick jungle, watched villages from a distance, and treated search parties as enemy patrols. When people came looking for them, Onoda did not see rescue. He saw capture. The danger was not only in the gunfire. It was in the misunderstanding. One side believed the war was over. The other side believed the same island was still enemy territory. That gap cost lives. The record around Onoda's years on Lubang is still debated, especially because Japanese memory and Filipino memory do not tell the same story in the same way. In Japan, many later saw him as a symbol of endurance and loyalty. On Lubang, many families remembered fear, raids, stolen food, burned crops, and deaths that happened long after peace had been declared. Some reports say Onoda and his companions were responsible for the deaths of up to 30 Filipino civilians over the years. The exact number is disputed, but the pain on the island was real. Families did not experience him as a legend. They experienced him as a man with a weapon who had not accepted that their lives were no longer part of his war. One reported case has stayed with descendants. Emilio Viana, a farmer on Lubang, was killed in 1951, years after Japan's surrender. His relatives later said he had been working when he was attacked. For them, the question was never whether Onoda was disciplined or brave. The question was why an ordinary man died because another man refused to believe the war had ended. And this is where the title becomes more than a strange fact. The Japanese officer who refused to surrender for 29 years did not simply hide. He kept acting. He kept judging people around him as threats. He kept following orders that no longer belonged to the world outside the jungle. By 1949, one of his own men began to break. Yuichi Akatsu separated from the group. For months, he lived alone, cut off from the others. Then in 1950, he surrendered to Philippine authorities. To the outside world, Akatsu had finally chosen reality. To Onoda, it looked like betrayal. That mattered. Because after Akatsu came down, the remaining men became even harder to reach. If one man could surrender, then maybe he could talk. If he could talk, then maybe search parties would know more. If search parties knew more, then every sound in the jungle became dangerous. Fear tightened around the group. In 1952, letters and photographs from family members were dropped into the area. Imagine that for a moment. You are hiding in the jungle, hungry, soaked, hunted, and suddenly your own family appears on paper, calling you home. You see faces from the life before the war. People who know your name. People who want you alive. Most men would break at that. Onoda did not. He believed the photos and letters were part of the deception. It was not because he had no evidence. It was because evidence had to pass through the wall built inside his mind. And that wall had been made from training, fear, pride, and orders. That is one of the hardest parts to understand today. We like to believe that truth wins once enough proof appears. But Onoda's life on Lubang shows something else. If a person is trained to distrust every source except one authority, then proof can arrive again and again and still fail. The jungle did not only hide him from the world, it protected his belief from being challenged in a normal way. Year after year, the islanders kept living under that shadow. A farmer could go out and wonder if someone was watching from the trees. A family could hear a noise at night and know it might not be an animal. The war had left the newspapers, but it had not left their fields. Then the group lost another man. Shoichi Shimada had stayed with Onoda through years of hunger and fear. In 1954, he was killed during an encounter with Philippine forces. Now only Onoda and Kinshichi Kozuka remained. Think about what that does to a person. One comrade gone by surrender. One dead. Every loss could have opened a door to doubt. Instead, it seems to have pushed Onoda deeper into certainty. If men had died, then the mission had to mean something. If the mission meant nothing, then all those years had been wasted. That is a dangerous trap. Sometimes people continue because they believe. Sometimes they continue because stopping would force them to face everything they had already done. If you are still watching, subscribe and like the video. Then drop your thoughts in the comments. Was history told right, or are we missing something? By the 1960s, Japan was no longer the ruined empire Onoda remembered. Tokyo was rising again. The country hosted the 1964 Olympics. Bullet trains were running. Families were buying televisions. A new generation was growing up with no memory of the Pacific War as a lived experience. But on Lubang, Onoda and Kozuka were still moving like ghosts from 1945. That contrast is almost impossible to hold in your mind. One Japan was modernizing, trading, rebuilding, and trying to define itself after defeat. Another Japan, trapped inside two men in the Philippine jungle, was still waiting for an army that would never come. This is why the story still causes arguments. Was Onoda a victim of military indoctrination? Was he a disciplined soldier obeying the only order he trusted? Was he responsible for what he did after the war ended? Or can more than one thing be true at the same time? A person can be trapped by his training and still cause harm. A person can suffer and still make others suffer. A man can be loyal and still be wrong. For Onoda, the outside world kept sending signals. Search teams came. Family members appealed. Newspapers and reports reached the area. But every message had to fight against the first command burned into him. Hold out, resist, wait for return. The longer he waited, the more reality turned against him. Then came October 19th, 1972. Onoda and Kozuka were still operating together. They had reportedly been involved in burning harvested rice, apparently believing it could signal Japanese forces or disrupt the enemy. To the people of Lubang, it was not strategy. It was their food. Their work, their survival, police responded. In the clash that followed, Kenshichi Kazuka was killed. Now Onoda was alone. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, there was no comrade to confirm his thinking. No one beside him to repeat the old assumptions. No one to share the hunger, the suspicion, or the silence. Just one man, aging in the jungle, still armed, still waiting. By then, Japan knew the name Hiroo Onoda. He had been declared dead at one point, then treated as missing, then almost mythical. He was no longer just a lost soldier. He was a national obsession, a question Japan could not fully answer. How many more men were out there? How long could the war keep echoing after the surrender? And what kind of country creates a soldier who refuses peace for almost 29 years? That last question is not an attack on Japan alone. Every nation that sends young men into war has to face some version of it. Armies depend on obedience. Survival in combat often depends on trust in orders. But what happens when the order survives longer than the war itself? What happens when discipline becomes a cage? By 1974, most official attempts had failed. Then Norio Suzuki entered the story. Suzuki was not a general. He was not a government negotiator. He was a young adventurer, and according to widely repeated accounts, he had joked that he was going to look for Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman in that order. It sounds almost foolish, but he did what governments had not done. He went to Lubang and found him. On February 20th, 1974, Suzuki encountered Onoda in the jungle. The meeting could have gone badly. Onoda was armed and still believed hostile forces might be using tricks. Suzuki was stepping into the private world of a man who had spent years expecting betrayal. But Suzuki did not come like a patrol. He came like someone willing to listen. That difference mattered. The two men talked. Suzuki explained that Japan had surrendered. He told Onoda that the war had ended long ago. But the old soldier still refused to leave. His reason was simple, and it revealed the lock that had held him in place since 1945. He had not been ordered to stop. This is the twist that makes the whole case feel colder. Onoda was not waiting because nobody told him the truth. He was waiting because the truth did not come from the one voice he had been trained to obey. So Suzuki returned to Japan with proof, photographs of himself with Onoda. Suddenly the rumor was a living man again. The Japanese government now had to solve a problem that was no longer theoretical. They needed the officer who had given the order. That man was Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. After the war, Taniguchi was no longer commanding troops. He had become a bookseller. His empire was gone. His army was gone. His war was history. But one order he had helped leave behind was still alive in the Philippine jungle. So Taniguchi was brought to Lubang. On March 9th, 1974, he met Onoda and formally relieved him of duty. Try to imagine the weight of that moment, not as a movie scene, not as a heroic painting. Think of it as two men standing with the wreckage of time between them. One had spent the post-war years in civilian life. The other had spent them sleeping under leaves, watching farmers, fearing traps, and carrying a rifle for a country that had surrendered before many modern Japanese adults were even born. Taniguchi gave the order. Only then did Onoda's war end. On March 10, 1974, Hiroo Onoda surrendered on Lubang Island. He was 52 years old. He came out with his sword, his old uniform, a working rifle, ammunition, and other military equipment that had somehow survived with him through the years. The next day, March 11th, he appeared at Malacañang Palace in Manila before Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos. Onoda offered his sword. Marcos granted him a pardon. That pardon became part of the wound. In Japan, Onoda's return created a sensation. Crowds received him. Newspapers covered him. Many saw him as proof of endurance, loyalty, and the old military spirit. In a country still wrestling with defeat, guilt, rebuilding, and identity, he became a strange mirror. Some people saw honor, some saw madness. Some saw a man who had wasted his life serving a dead command. But on Lubang, families had a different memory. They remembered the years when the jungle was not safe. They remembered fields watched by armed men. They remembered animals taken, crops burned, and people who did not come home. For them, the surrender ceremony did not erase the fear. A pardon from a president could settle a legal question, but it could not bring back the dead. That is why this story should never be told as a simple legend. If you tell it only as loyalty, you erase Lubang. If you tell it only as evil, you miss the machinery that created him. Onoda was not born in the jungle as a symbol. He was made by a military system that treated surrender as disgrace, obedience as virtue, and death as preferable to capture. He was then abandoned by history, sealed inside his orders, and left to interpret every human gesture as enemy deception. But the victims on Lubang were not symbols either. They were people living ordinary lives under an extraordinary mistake that refused to end. After returning to Japan, Onoda struggled with the world he found. The country was modern, crowded, changed. The values he had carried like sacred equipment no longer fit cleanly into daily life. In 1975, he moved to Brazil and became a cattle rancher. Later, he returned to Japan and started a nature school for young people. He died in Tokyo on January 16, 2014 at 91. Even his death did not settle the argument. Some remembered him as the soldier who would not quit. Others remembered what his refusal cost. The strongest truth is not comfortable enough for either side. Hiroo Onoda endured almost beyond imagination. He also helped keep fear alive on Lubang long after the war should have been over. And maybe that is why the story still feels dangerous today. Because Onoda's jungle was not only made of trees, it was made of orders that could not be questioned. It was made of propaganda that taught doubt in the wrong direction. It was made of pride, isolation, fear, and the terrible human need to believe that sacrifice must have meaning. Today we live in a world where people can still disappear into beliefs that no amount of evidence can reach. They may not be hiding on an island with a rifle, but they can still reject every source except the one voice they trust. They can still call truth a trick. They can still treat neighbors like enemies because someone taught them to see the world that way. That is the part of Hiroo Onoda's life that should make us uneasy. Not just that he kept fighting after the war ended, but that he was given proof again and again, and proof failed. Thanks for watching till the end. Subscribe to Drafted History, like the video, and share your thoughts below. Then watch another story from the channel. So what do you think history should call Hiroo Onoda? A loyal soldier trapped by his orders, a dangerous man who refused reality, or both at the same time?